Afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Corrie Williams. I'm the Executive Director of Collaboration and Innovation here at Master Builders Victoria. And before I proceed any further, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on today, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and express my respect to their elders, both past and present. It is with great pleasure today that we welcome you to a joint MBV, CIOB and Built Offsite event, and we're honoured to have Mark Farmer, a distinguished fellow of the CIOB and a leading authority in the field of construction, join us today. Mark is renowned for his advocacy of modern methods of construction, as I'm sure you're all aware, and his valuable insights into how the industry can transition towards innovative, efficient and sustainable building practices. Today we have the privilege of hearing from Mark Farmer himself, along with Martin Fenn and Jake Crosby from the CSR. MBV have been working on various projects over the last 10 years, investigating how modern methods of construction will benefit the industry, their implications and the drivers for change. As industry partners for the Building 4.0 CRC since its inception, we continue to track the latest developments in this space and inform our members. Last year, we launched our Building a Transition report, providing an understanding of industry best practice across different international jurisdictions, including the challenges and requirements for Victoria to foster the development and applications of modern methods of construction. We'll continue this work through our collaboration and innovation team and with events like our upcoming industry breakfast on May 30th. Today, I'd like to introduce you to Jake Crosby, who's the Business Development Manager at CSR. So please join me in extending a warm welcome to Jake, and thank you, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we just wanted to have a quick call out for the CIOB and Built Offsite. Through this series and through CSR sponsorship, we wanted to gain better engagement with industry and get broader associations happening to talk about constructive change with modern methods. So with that said, thank you, Martin.
Thanks, Jake. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Martin Fenn. I'm the MMC lead for the CIOB Oceania as a volunteer. Professionally, I'm an independent MMC consultant. So thank you for gathering here today. Thank you for your support. Thanks to Master Builders Victoria. Thanks to CSR for sponsoring. Thanks to Built Offsite publication. And of course, Mark Farmer for agreeing to come here today. So we saw Mark was in Melbourne and picked up the phone, gave Mark a call, said, "Hey Mark, you're in Melbourne?" He goes, "Yeah." Said, "Could you give us an hour of your time, please?" He goes, "Well, yeah, I can. I'm on holiday with my wife." I said, "Mark, it'll be 1 hour, we promise." So then we had one of these moments. We're like, wow, okay, Mark Farmer's coming. We need a venue, we need sponsors, So picked up the phone to Michael, and look, within 48 hours, we had a venue, we had a sponsor, and we had all of you here today. Call it, 60 or 70 people in total. So thank you very much, and well done to Michael. Thank you.
Well done to you.
So just a little bit about the CIOB. We're the world's largest professional membership body in construction. So we've got 48,000 members worldwide. We're global. However, we've got hubs in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, as well as New Zealand. Now, why is MMC relevant? Well, our members cover a broad spectrum of disciplines across the whole of the built environment. So that's essentially cradle to grave. So we've got architects, engineers, main contractors, off-site manufacturers, PMs, QSs, all the way through to demolition contractors. Now, this event is part of our MMC series and follows on from our Sydney event a couple of weeks ago, which we had with CSR, Built Offsite. And it's about showcasing what good looks like. Some of the great work that is happening in Australia today, as well as bringing in global perspective. So thank you, Mark, for providing that today. And what we need to focus on is that MMC is not just about what happens off-site. Modern methods construction is also about on-site efficiencies, productivity gains on-site, such as 3D printing and the use of drones even. So this afternoon, Mark Farmer, CEO of Cast Consultancy, advising the UK government on MMC, is here to share his lessons learned. And I urge you to read one of his reports, Modernise or Die. Now, although it was written in 2016, it highlighted the severe crisis around labour. And since that report's been written, we have had COVID added to the mix. So in the report, the analogy is the construction industry is like a sick or dying patient. So the construction industry needs curing, and MMC is the antidote. Now Mark will speak for around about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open up the floor to questions, open discussion. So guys, please don't be shy. And after that 1 hour, Mark's gonna run, and then we've got a wrap up, and then we've got time for networking and drinks. So thank you very much, and a big round of applause to Mark for coming here today.
Thank you, Martin, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you to everyone who's made this event happen at short notice. It's always a good opportunity when you travel this far from the UK to sort of just really share the learning, spread the word, and importantly, for what I'm going to say over the next 20 minutes or so, perhaps reflect on some of the things that you don't want to do, because actually part of what I'm going to talk about is stuff that is about lessons learned. And I think that is an important bit of international collaboration where countries are at different points in their construction maturity and are attempting to change the way they do things and modernise. To take my challenge that Martin's just referenced in 2016, it's a rocky road. And what we've seen in the UK is a pretty rocky road, and there's reasons for that, which I'm going to talk about in a second. What I've done, I hastily, I've just been speaking at an event in central Melbourne for the UDIA, and I thought I'd take some of the slides, condense it down to what I think are the most pertinent issues with an Australian relevance. The slides, there's still too many in here, so I'm going to skip through some of them and just dwell perhaps on the ones that I think are probably the most relevant for the discussion. But where I start with this is why are we talking about modernisation? We're talking about modernisation because we have a problem in the industry which is linked to resource. We have a construction skills challenge. I don't think that will be news to anyone. We don't have enough people to do the work that is put in front of us. We have an ageing demographic. We have more people forecast to retire than to potentially join the industry. In the UK, we have an added issue around migration, or lack of, which we've historically been really reliant on for supplementing our labour supply. I think from an Australian perspective, that's less of an issue, albeit there's a political sensitivity about migration and pressure on Australian infrastructure and housing, etc., etc. So there's lots of parallels that I see between the UK and Australia. I'm lucky enough to be involved in some stuff happening here at the moment over in Sydney, and I've been working with the New Zealand government as well. So I have some context around this part of the world with which to sort of triangulate back to UK and share that journey. So where we are at the moment in the UK is not necessarily a happy space, and so some of that is around the fact that we have a loss of confidence from government in the construction sector's ability to deliver. And a lot of that is linked back to the fact that all of these problems we have around our workforce are manifesting themselves around high costs. So we have a massive inflation issue post-COVID. which is partly down to supply chains being interrupted. There's a Ukraine energy crisis type issue playing out, particularly in Europe at the moment as well. But we also have labour and structural wage inflation that are pushing the cost of construction up, and that spooked a lot of governments. In the UK, we have a big infrastructure spending programme which has actually been reined back just at a time when our economy, and I'll come back to the UK economy in a second, has taken a real slide in the last 12-18 months, mostly because of political volatility. We should be spending on public works like there's no tomorrow. And actually the government are sitting there and they've binned elements like HS2, one of the biggest infrastructure projects in Europe. The high-speed rail link from London to the north of England has been cut back. We have a school building programme, a hospital building programme that is spinning its gears at the moment. And some of that is because politicians look at construction and think it's going to cost too much money. It's going to take too long to do. Actually, let's just spend it on something else. And in Australia, I see elements of that as well. So these headlines are really sort of an Australian context around some of the pressure you've got on your infrastructure delivery as well, to deliver on time, on cost, to a quality, and the fact that there's a real risk that you're going to potentially end up where I think we've got ourselves to in the UK around, in your case, state governments, whether it's Victoria or New South Wales or Western Australia, saying actually the business case for doing that is not there. So the construction industry is under the microscope at the moment. So despite all of the issues around the workforce challenges we have, building new homes, you name it, most governments view construction with suspicion, which is not a good starting place. And I've been advising the UK government, or trying to, which is probably the relevant point, for the last 8 years or so, and I've seen politicians up close. I've seen them scratch their heads and ask the question, why is your industry like it is? And they can't fathom it out. And some politicians know construction because they've been with developers or done house building or whatever, and they're closer to it, but they still get really frustrated about the inability of our industry to deliver things that politicians want them to do that is good news story for the economy. The reality is they're missing a trick that we do, that we just do it in a fairly painful way. Everything we do around infrastructure, everything you see out there that's built is down to us. And politicians forget that because it's not sexy, it's not, we have a big thing in the UK where automotive and aerospace are viewed as sort of the poster child for political support, including funding support, whereas construction's always seen as the poor relation. And these headlines, I put it up here just to sort of set the tone around the fact that you've got a lot going on here in Australia. You've got some major infrastructure programs, including here in Melbourne, and because politics is cyclical, then decisions around investing in major programs comes and goes, and you get stop-start. So actually we're at a point, I think, where the performance of the construction industry and all the reasons to modernise the industry is even more important, because what historically would have been a counter-cyclical position around government saying, look, if the economy's coming off a bit, housing is down, let's just put more money into public infrastructure. In the UK, in the last 18 months, we haven't seen that. So the downturn we have in UK construction at the moment has been pretty painful. And that's the reason for some of what I'm going to talk about in a second around MMC and modern methods and some of the bad news stories we've seen, because we've got a synchronised downturn, not just in private sector investment, but in some infrastructure programmes as well. So the construction industry has been in recession in the UK. The national economy has just come out of recession, but construction is in a deep fall in output, which is affecting it. And it's doing a lot of damage at the moment, not just to MMC, but to the wider construction sector and its long-term prospects. And one of the things that I think is interesting is the labour markets. So if I come back to labour, construction labour, there's some interesting differences between UK and Australia, as I see it. So even though we have a lot of similarities, there are some differences, and the first one I'd say is that post-COVID, according to the statistics I've seen, you've managed to grow your construction workforce. And I was quite surprised when I saw that, because everything I hear, and anecdotally, is that there's massive pressure on, there's not enough people. You haven't got enough tradies, you haven't got enough people to do the work, and I was expecting to see a stat which showed that the Australian construction workforce had gone down post-COVID, which is what's happened in the UK. We've lost 15% of our entire national construction workforce since COVID. and that's not sustainable. For us, that's before you think about demographics, that's before you think about the fact we haven't got enough young people coming in. That's just a structural shift in less economically active workers, migrant workers repatriating mostly to Europe during COVID, not coming back. So we've got a massive hollowing out of our workforce. In Australia, as I understand it, you've managed to get workforce back up to above pre-COVID levels. But my view is you have a long-term downward pressure on your workforce. Everyone I talk to in Australian construction is worried about the fact there's not enough young people coming in. It's not really seen as a career of choice. It's really difficult to motivate people to want to come into not just professional services, but like surveying and architecture and engineering, but obviously on-site skills, artisan skills, trade skills, be seen with the regard that we should have for skilled tradespeople. And that's a big issue. You also have a less casualised workforce than the UK. So 40% of the entire UK workforce is self-employed labour, whereas I understand here it's about 20%. You have more wage controls through unionisation here in Australia. It's probably a good thing in some respects around the fact that the casualisation of the UK workforce means that it's very much hunt and kill. So the self-employed workforce goes out, charges top dollar when things are good, and then actually ends up underemployed or unemployed with no security or benefits in a downturn, which is what we're seeing at the moment. So that workforce sort of backdrop is relevant for, even though it's different to the UK, between the UK and Australia, I think there's a common issue around the fact that you have structural wage inflation driven by scarcity of labour. You have the need to attract more people. You have the need to get more productivity out of the existing workforce, despite the fact that the makeup of the workforce and unionisation versus casualisation is slightly different. The reason I think this is even more important, so I've talked about infrastructure and the need for us to modernise to keep government confidence in the sector. You also have a sector a bit like the UK where you're not standing still, you're actually having to go faster. And that is partly around regulations. So you've got a new NCC, National Construction Code, which is driving standards higher. In Resi, you have the NHERS, I think we're moving to 7 stars as a minimum, which means that your build quality is going up. You have, over in New South Wales, you've got David Chandler, let off the leash, doing all sorts of stuff. Some people will view that as good, some people will view it as bad, depending what side of the fence you're on. But there's a lot going on there, which means that the industry's got to work harder to stand still. The regulatory environment, the backdrop to actually doing work is getting more complex, just at a time when you have all this pressure on skills. And then, I've talked about infrastructure, I've talked about regulation, I've talked about the fact there's not enough people, and then I sort of touched on productivity. And for me, productivity is a central theme here because, what we've got to face into is there's so much waste that goes on in our industry. If we were to try and attack some of that, we wouldn't have half the problem we have in terms of not having enough people to do the work. So we talk about, getting more kids in. We've got to keep doing that. We've got to try and inspire kids to join our industry. But this study in the UK worked out that actually 20% of everything we do is this rectifying errors. So we're spending 120% of effort for every unit of output that we create as an industry. And that's before you get on to just productive time on site, like tool time at the workplace, which anecdotally is somewhere between 30 and 50% of your average tradies' day is physically doing stuff. The rest of it's other stuff. So that's huge. You think about that in an industry the size of construction, you think about the opportunity just to have a little bit of that back. And what does that mean around pressure off resources? So we don't have to go and press gang kids as much as we do at the moment. We can improve quality, we can improve certainty for government, build back confidence is really, really important. And I think this is a critical bit of the voiceover as to why modern methods, why innovation is so important, because as Martin said, the MMC is not just about doing stuff off-site, it's actually doing stuff on-site better and improving productivity in a two-pronged attack by creating factory conditions for higher levels of productivity in remote environments, but actually planning work, designing work, clienting work better, so that actually what is done on site is done more productively as well. If you attack it from both ends, we can get some of this back, but it takes the pressure off the workforce quantum that I've characterised this issue as being. And where this is all manifesting itself, so all this big pressure on the workforce, regulatory reform, lots of stuff having to go fast and stand still, is manifesting itself through the quality of what we do. And this is an extract from a UK platform, which they're quite active on social media. If you're on TikTok and stuff like that, you go to New Home Quality Control. It's quite an amusing TikTok account. A guy from Wales in the UK that goes around the volume house builders in the UK snagging their work, and it's quite depressing because the quality of some of the things he comes up with, and you'll see it if you go on the Instagram, you'll see it live in video, is shocking. Shocking is a word he uses a lot, and it's basically all of these sort of things. These are the top things he spots, and the correlation is most of the things here respond to areas of labour intensity on site. So it's about external wall construction, roof, MEP, all the areas where people, we need lots of people to do stuff. And here in Oz, I know you've got similar issues. I've spoken to enough people. It's not just New South Wales. There is an issue with quality. And it's a function of the fact that if you haven't got enough people who are skilled and competent in what they're doing, mistakes get made. It doesn't matter how, as a builder or developer, it doesn't matter how much you try and protect your brand and try and drive that, it's tough because you're completely dependent on the workforce you have at the workplace doing the work that's needed to the necessary standard. And you can't man-mark all of this. So, this creates a real risk of an unravelling, which again goes back to confidence. So I talked about government confidence. One of the issues we have in the UK is there's a public confidence issue in the construction industry, most of it through house building, because there's so many of these headlines now have found their way to mainstream media, not just newspapers, but TV programmes doing exposés on house builders and poor quality work. So you've got this double whammy of government not sure whether it can trust construction, the public saying, can I trust a new build house? We have a whole dysfunctional warranty system as well in the UK, where a lot of warranty providers are under pressure because they're not really covering defective work. So the consumer is feeling slightly put out, and government have started to think about regulating this area. So there's another risk of more regulation coming in. So let me just pivot to the main thing I wanted to talk to you about, which is the journey we've been on. In response to all of that, that sort of sets the scene for why we need to modernise, because there's a lot of pressure on the industry. Things are getting tougher, we don't have enough people, we need to build with better quality, we need to get some of the waste and improve the productivity back. So we've been on this modernisation journey, and certainly when I wrote my report in 2016, I was lucky enough to get a reaction from government. It responded to my review and said we're going to support modern methods in the round, not just off-site, but digital construction, productivity improvement measures. We're going to get behind it as a policy measure. We're going to help industry innovate. We're going to help with R&D funding. So we've been on a really positive journey since 2016, where there's been a lot of headway made. And that's been, from a personal perspective, really, really satisfying to see us start to do stuff. By no means anywhere near, being a mainstream tipping point, right, we're getting there. There was always a risk that this could go back the other way. And guess what? In 2022, we had 3 prime ministers in about 3 months. We had massive political upheaval. The economy tanked on the back of that. We went into recession. We had interest rates going up. We had inflation through the roof anyway because of Ukraine and other geopolitical issues. But our construction sector got hit with a sledgehammer, housing being the most exposed. So to give you an idea, the relativity, so that last year leading up to Liz Truss being the Prime Minister, we would have delivered about 230,000 new homes in the UK. This year, I'll be surprised if we do 150, probably less than that. So the house builders, all the volume house builders in the UK who do about 60% of all the delivery, post-global financial crisis all got burnt. So now they only build what they can sell. And as soon as the economy goes into reverse, they stop building. They just turn the tap off on all live developments. And that has completely dismantled the supply chain in the UK construction sector, particularly the house building element, but it sort of overlaps into commercial construction as well because it's affected apartment buildings and commercial grade mixed use developments. And what that's meant is all of that progress that I spoke about has been derailed, and these headlines are reflections of that. And when you've got an innovating market that's trying to invest in doing things differently, including setting up factories and investing in technology or whatever, they're the first to get hurt. Because traditional construction is a pretty fleet of foot model. You know, it's subcontracted, it's basically keep your overheads low. So actually when the developer says stop, you basically haven't got much to scale back on. You're either using flexible labour, you don't have, you know, a factory, you can stop start. It's still painful, particularly for the workforce and the level of employment. But if you've got a factory, particularly if you've got a startup business that's got a factory, like some of these businesses who are certainly single family housing modular companies, you've got nowhere to go. So all of these companies had set up in a period when the government said, yeah, we want you to do this, we're going to promote this, we think it's the right thing to do, and you know, just get your businesses set up, it'll be fine. And then in 2022, the economy went like that, and it wasn't fine. And it's a massive learning from the reality that of firstly the role of government in what their role is to create sustainable innovation, and secondly the role of the supply chain to come up with sustainable business models that are resilient enough to pass the test of an economic downturn. Because all of these headlines relate to businesses that ultimately were too geared towards residential, they weren't spread across multiple sectors, so when the housing market they spent too much money without having resiliency of their demand being identified, so understanding their pipeline. So it's a sort of build it and they'll come mentality. You know, this was also played out internationally, by the way, so many of you would have heard of Katera in the US that went through a similar process of, you know, saying that we're going to completely revolutionise the industry. They did it on steroids though, $3 billion from SoftBank, all failed, and that wasn't even a recession. Really, that was just their model didn't work. At least in the UK, we had the excuse of big economic downturn in the housing market, which has created a lot of pain. So behind these headlines, there's a lot of personal stories of people being laid off, people losing their livelihoods. So this is something that we need to take seriously, and it has deep consequences, I would suggest, for Australia and for other international markets around making sure that governments who are promoting innovation, and in Australia I see it on a state level, and most of what I'm doing is in New South Wales, but I believe it's the same here in Victoria and in Queensland, is it can't be innovation at all costs. It's got to be innovation that industry can deliver resiliently on a long-term basis, that isn't a fad, that isn't something that's just a nice thing to do, that politicians can, you know, go and cut a ribbon at a factory and walk away and leave industry to it. We've got to have solutions that move us forward in a way that they're actually going to be here in 6 months, 6 years, you know, however long, you know, we're talking about. It can't be a passing fancy. And there's 3 main reasons that I would say have contributed to that derailment as I've characterised it. One of which I've spoken a lot about, which is the economy. So, you know, we've got an economic downturn, which is a lot of it sort of linked to what happened in 2022 when Liz Truss was Prime Minister for literally a matter of weeks. She did a budget, and within a few days the market got spooked, lost confidence in the UK economy, interest rates escalated overnight, housing market ground to a halt effectively. But there's also a linked problem, which I see similarities to here in Australia around the planning system. There's 2 linked things here around why it's really high risk to do some forms of innovation, which are about the economic volatility that I've talked about the fact that the planning system in the UK is broken. So even if we didn't have an economic downturn, we were already experiencing this massive issue with our pipeline starting to become disrupted by schemes not getting to site because it didn't have consents. And I sort of pick up some similarities. It's a state-by-state basis, but certainly in Sydney, and I sense from headlines it's the same here in Melbourne as well, There's problems getting permits, there's problems getting approvals. So actually, even if you've got the desire and the need, actually the system doesn't allow it. The conference I've just been speaking at earlier today talked a lot about NIMBYs here. So there's a political need, a political will to drive through that and say we are going to allow development to happen. Obviously subject to controls, because people won't be investing in factories, they won't be investing in innovation unless they have a relatively de-risked planning environment before you even got onto the world of what's your economic backdrop to your market. So this is a big deal. So you need to sort of stress test your business model when you're setting up in an innovative company, particularly an off-site manufacturing business. You've got to have this in mind, which is what happens if. So at the moment, the planning system isn't going to change anytime soon. So it would be wrong for any business out there to say, let's assume the planning system's going to get resolved and we move to a rules-based planning system, no democratic planning. That would be cloud cuckoo land. So you've got to stress test your business by saying, if I've got X number of jobs and Y number of them are going through planning, only half of them, for instance, are going to get through. And you create a risking of your profile, and then you test your spend in your investment relative to that, otherwise your business is at risk. And that's the same, to be honest, if you're a traditional builder using artisan labour, as it is if you're an MMC manufacturer. It should be the same principle. There's nothing, I'm not talking rocket science here, but you'd be surprised how many mistakes were made on the fact that people weren't allowing for this kind of volatility. And as I say, I see certain elements of parallels to that political, the economic and planning turmoil that we've had in the UK affecting delivery. So even listening to the news this morning, or was it yesterday, I think you were some of the lowest levels of housing output at the moment. Some of that may be about the strength and resilience of your housing market. I suspect a lot of it around planning, not being able to get permits and approvals for sites. And on the back of that, with sort of economic fragility, albeit not where we are in the UK, you've got masses of problems with insolvency in your supply chain. You've got builders going bust like there's no tomorrow. This is a real heady cocktail of issues that we all have to contend with. And if you've got traditional builders going bust who don't have any overheads, then if you've got a factory, it's even how do you make that work? And this is the part of squaring the circle of how we're going to innovate in a way that enables us to build a business case for change, respecting all of this up and down cyclical boom and bust type market that we operate in. And government has a role to play here, because what it should be doing is propping up the market when there's down pressure on private sales, for instance, with other sources of construction activity that keep demand up, that enable innovation to happen safely, to enable the sector not to be hollowed out, which is what we're seeing in the UK at the moment. The second reason I sort of alluded to just now is the fact that lots of businesses in the UK that set up in the last 5-6 years, particularly off-site manufacturing businesses, and particularly volumetric, modular, single-family housing companies, which is where most of the failures have been in the UK. So Ilka, L&G, you might have heard some of these names. They spent a lot of money, and if I'm brutally honest, I'm not quite sure why they spent that money on the back of their route to market. Because at the point they were spending the money, and you always have to spend in advance of de-risking your commitment, their penetration into the mainstream housing market wasn't there. And the progress in which they were trying to convince clients to buy a modular home as opposed to building a traditional home wasn't apparent. They weren't making the inroads. There's an element of having to prove to the market what you can do before you go all in and spend £100 million on a factory. I saw too many examples of people just saying, let's get the factory set up, let's spend all this money, let's go and hire 500 people, which is what at least one business did. And then, by that time, the pipeline will be there. And it wasn't. And that's before you got to the recession that we hit. Some of this is about just being a good business person. I'm really disappointed that actually some of those that were in charge of innovative companies in the MMC space, which has been under so much pressure, have ended up being poor business people. And that's a sort of fairly edgy thing to say, and I'm not going to call out names or whatever, but there's individuals and there's a collective responsibility. But there's some really bad mistakes that end up being just down to, can you run a business? You've got costs and revenues, you've got cash flow, there's some basic things that should have been sorted. But in fairness, the other side to that is that the government, UK government, marched the industry up the hill saying, innovate, it's great, we want this, we want different ways of building homes, we want to build with high productivity. Government have also pulled the rug, so it's made it worse. So the whole idea of saying, look, come into the sector, invest, at least one business, taxpayer money was put in to support its balance sheet, which was Ilka Homes on the previous slide. They put £60 million, 120 million Aussie dollars into that business, but then they didn't connect it with any mandate on the demand side. They didn't go and tell the affordable homes providers, for instance, to go and use Ilka Homes. They just said, just go and, it would be nice for you to use Ilka, but it's down to you, really. Then guess what? In an industry like ours, and there's a sort of choice between doing things traditionally and innovatively, they're not going to do it unilaterally. Government has a role to play in structuring the market and forcing change in a controlled way, so you don't have unintended consequences, and he didn't do it. And bearing in mind, I've had a government advisory role, I felt deeply uncomfortable about the lack of join-up in the strategy that the UK government ended up having, particularly with the political volatility over the last 2 years in particular. It's obviously had other issues on its mind. It's been diverted, it's had its attention drawn, and it's sort of dropped MMC, it's dropped construction, to be quite honest, like a hot potato. And that's left all these failures really, really high profile. There's been a lot of bad press. You've probably heard there's a House of Lords inquiry that's happened. It's all, to be honest, all the findings of that are no surprise to anyone. It's all basic stuff. What I'm telling you now is not like, something, oh wow, I didn't know that. This is just basic stuff. It's just the consequences of not having a proper strategy to join up demand with supply side support, resiliency around running a good business, etc., etc., etc. The third item, and you may know less about this, but I'm going to be really honest about this, about lessons learned, is that some of the businesses in this space, particularly around off-site construction, didn't even technically deliver. So forget the business model, just what they said they were going to do around high quality work, to a consistent standard, better than traditional, which is what the mantra has been for MMC. It must be better if you build it in a factory than building it on a cold, dirty building site. Actually, some of those businesses, probably driven by financial pressures to get stuff done and out the factory and just do some stuff and prove they're active, made some pretty horrendous errors. Some of these headlines relate to that, where there's been issues with the build quality, there's been issues with, and some of this outside of housing actually, so in schools, we've had modular schools that had to be torn down 3 years after build because of systemic failure. So when you do something in a manufactured way, it's not randomised failure, it's systemic, and they found the same problem again and again and again, so the whole thing has had to be overhauled. And this is not a good look for a sector that's trying to change and demonstrate that business case to clients on the fact that we can do it better. And I think most intelligent clients will see through this and recognise that there's a set of circumstances that have led to pressure on businesses going too quickly. But I'm saying this because from an Australian perspective, if you want to innovate, then it shouldn't be innovation at all costs. I've already said that. It should be responsible innovation that enables you to prove that what you're doing is going to be better than the alternative, which is the reason we're all talking about it in the first place, to overcome labour challenges, to overcome defects, risk, to improve speed, to improve certainty of delivery. Despite all that negativity, I would say when we have done stuff well in the UK, it's been bloody good. And in this photograph, this is in Croydon in South London, you've got 2 of the 3 tallest volumetric modular buildings in the world. The building on the left is the second tallest in the world, only completed a few months ago, owned by BlackRock, the private equity fund. It's a co-living space, it's 50 odd stories, and then on the right, building that was completed shortly before it by Greystar, who I see are active here in Melbourne doing build to rent. which is 45 stories. That's a built-to-rent development, and that's one business has done both of those. There's only one business in the UK that can do this complexity of high-rise volumetric modular, and unfortunately, that's great. There's a fantastic advert for UK MMC and full modular construction in this instance, but one business isn't going to change an industry. And the problem is this becomes exemplar by exception. It's not a scalable proposition. We can't do this again and again and again because there's only one business in the UK that can do it. So, there's some real positives, but it's about the scalability of the positives that we have issues with. And what I would also say is, despite all of that, does that mean we're not going to see MMC happen in UK? Yes, we are. This is the sort of flip to what I've just shown you, because a lot of the issues I've just shown you are particularly around volumetric modular and starting new businesses at scale. So to set up for 5,000 units a year in a market that doesn't really exist in the UK. What's happened is all the house builders in the UK, the volume players, and a lot of these headlines relate to our largest house builders and contractors, have all seen this happening off to the side. They all see regulatory reform, what I showed with you around whether it's future homes and decarbonisation, whether it's building safety, and they say, well, we've got to innovate, we've got to increase our level of pre-manufacture, we've got to reduce our site labour because they can't get labour, and they need to build higher performing buildings. So they've decided that the route to do that is more hybrid construction. So this is becoming to my point around the big learning, it's where the UK market is now headed. It's moving towards a hybrid model where we're taking panelisation, we're taking mini volumetric pods of parts of the fit out, and we're putting that together in a composite way with traditional construction. So all of these MMC techniques, particularly timber framing, but also modularisation of internal fit out, is done alongside traditional tradies working on site, finishing it off. So this is not about entire houses or apartments being craned into position. This is an evolving world of incremental change where the level of manufacturing is going to increase, the way in which house builders are organising their workforce is improving because they know they can't get enough tradies, particularly bricklayers. We have a massive problem with bricklayer shortages in the UK. Not at the moment because no one's building anything, but when we go again, we will. Because there's unemployed bricklayers at the moment sitting at home in London, believe it or not. But hopefully in a year or two's time, when we go back into growth, you won't be able to find a bricklayer for love nor money. That's the problem around hollowing out, because some of those brickies will take early retirement. Some of them have been earning so much money, which is a good thing, in the recent period of growth, that they just said, I've got enough money, I'm going to retire. Some of the particularly the ones that are really burnt out on doing price work, retiring at 50 years old. Some of them, during the growth period pre-lease trusts, were earning so much money, they'd only do a 3-day week and go on the golf course 2 days a week, because they decided, I'm not going to burn out, I'm just going to earn that amount of money and then, as a self-employed tradie, not go to work. That's their choice. But this all puts the industry under further exposure to sustainability. I'd also point out a really interesting trend of the supply chain in UK construction. And these two players here, Saint-Gobain and Etex, are European, French and Belgian companies, very active in the UK, big platforms. Our sponsor here, CSR, talking to Saint-Gobain as part of a corporate acquisition strategy. What's really interesting is both of them massive companies, international multi-billion pound businesses, bigger than most of the clients that they serve. So most of the contractors they provide materials to are just a fraction of the size of these businesses. What they've worked out is they need to be further up the value chain. And they've worked out that the way to do that is to increase the pre-manufactured value of their components. So what they're doing is they're consolidating components into clusters, elemental clusters, rather than raw materials. They're panelising stuff, they're podding stuff, offering more solutions, so still to the trade market as contractors. They're not pretending to be contractors, they don't want to be a contractor, they're manufacturers, but they're creating a different mix because they recognise that's where the future's going, because there's going to be less people to do the work, so they're gearing up their product portfolio to suit that. So I thought I'd reference that because I think it's an important trend. I think it's a global trend. I think you'll see it in this part of the world as well. And just to manifest what I've been talking about around hybrid construction, that in housing, single family housing, is what it sort of looks like in my experience. So we've moved for sort of an open panel timber frame model. We're starting now to put windows in and closed panels as well. We're starting to put facades on in factory as well, putting brick slips and stuff like that. We're starting to look at MEP and think rather than do all this on site, let's package some of the stuff up and do pre-manufactured vanity units or utility cupboards, take some of the pressure off site. That is what the domestic housing market is starting to evolve into. In the commercial grade construction market for residential, it's starting to reflect units of precast frames, unitised facades, bathroom pods becoming very popular now on multi-family development, prefabbed M&E, plant rooms, risers, even the runouts starting to be done in factories and then just lifted into position. A lot of this is not new. It actually started here in Melbourne with the likes of Hickory that many of you will know. Mace, who are a British company that are operating internationally, have taken a license on the Hickory concept and they're using it in London at the moment. We've got schemes being built using Hickory methodology in London as we speak by Mace. So it sort of tells you that even though we talk about modern methods, a lot of this has been around a long time, and actually the Hickory story is quite interesting around, I believe it started as a volumetric business and then worked back into realising that was too constraining. This allowed you to have more architectural versatility to reduce the manufacturing reliance on big factories to do all of this stuff. And just sort of talking about maturity, so I mentioned David Chandler earlier on. I just think there's a really interesting piece around how you get, when you've got an active regulatory environment, and New South Wales got a building commission. I don't know what the situation is in Victoria, whether there's moves afoot to replicate that or not. But he's a man on a mission, which is going to create a lot of problems for those businesses that fall foul of being able to prove quality. He's creating he's talking about a system where you can have trust. He talks about trust a lot. You're probably aware of the Equifax ISA rating system that's been brought out as well, which is all part of this. I think it's an interesting look into a world where actually TripAdvisor is going to come to construction. And ultimately we're going to have more exposure to ratings and safeguards around how we do stuff and how we get consumer confidence, and also that government can sit behind. Just a couple of other examples in Ireland, where I've also got some interface with the Irish government. They've looked at UK and thought, wow, we don't want to make that mistake. So they're actually doing a sort of root and branch MMC strategy that is holistic. So they're trying to avoid marching the industry up to the top of the hill when they're marching it down again. They're thinking about demand side stimuli. They're thinking about building capacity. They're thinking about warranty standards, building control standards to reflect MMC, which is what the New Zealand government have done, which is that extract on the right hand side is the New Zealand government have got statutory change to their, I can't remember the name of the bill now, it's modular components and products bill, I think it is, that enables you to get a fast track building control sign off if you use accredited pre-manufactured solutions. In the UK we don't have that. And that's part of the problem we've had, is that we haven't evolved our building control approach to reflect manufacturing type techniques. I'm just conscious of time. I'm just going to share one initiative, and I'm involved in this. This is my link into Australian construction at the moment. So New South Wales, School Infrastructure New South Wales, who are doing a school building programme over down Sydney Way, have come up with this delivery strategy. Some of you might know a guy called Anthony Manning, who runs that and comes from he's quite a big advocate of MMC, trying to push things in a different way. They've recently launched what they call the Manufacturing for Schools programme, M4S. Basically, all about digital design, digital kit of parts, so hybrid, not volumetric, all about component parts that come together in a digital inventory with a different procurement regime wrapped around it. So this is actually challenging the traditional contractor model. So actually the winning party on this is a consultant, it's APP, project management. In conjunction with Lippmann, who many of you will know from, so there is a contractor still in there, But this is going to potentially upset the apple cart around new ways of delivering, in this instance, schools, but it could be hospitals, it could be prisons, it could be defence, it could be houses. And I think it's really interesting. There's some digital elements to it. So there's Giraffe, which some of you might know as an Aussie digital configuration platform. Do a lot of work in New South Wales. There's a platform called Land IQ. Some of you might be aware of on the planning side. Arc is like a digital kit of parts configuration platform that sits with it. So there's a lot going on in this space, and I'll just put it up there. It's quite early stages. But the reason I've shared it is really because a lot of people say, oh, let's look to Great Britain or the US around where innovation is happening because you're behind the game. I don't think you are. I think you're doing some really interesting stuff actually. You've got an opportunity to do it and not make the mistakes that perhaps others have done. So, small acorns, but an interesting take on where your market is at the moment. And I'm going to close. I'm going to get a divorce if I'm not careful. My wife's still waiting for me. With just a watch out around what I've seen in the UK, which is driven by emotion. So because of all the failure we've seen, which has been really painful, as I've said, it's quite emotive around what that does to people, particularly in the MMC space, where there's a lot of people really passionate about wanting to do things differently. They, even when things were good, it was about trying to convince people to do things differently and fighting the tide. But actually, when things are bad, it gets really depressing. And what unfortunately happens is that you start to get infighting. And what we've seen in the UK is that the material lobbies, whether it's masonry or concrete, steel or timber, have all started having a go at each other for market share, declining market share. They're all starting to take pot shots at each other around who's best. And then in the MMC space, you've got, the panelised sector having a go at volumetric, saying it's better than the panelised sector. And a lot of people looking at that thinking, what's going on? You're having a fight amongst yourselves. And that's quite unseemly, and we've got to hold our nerve around coming back to the reasons why we need to innovate. It shouldn't be fighting over market share, it should be fighting to make the cake bigger. So there's enough for everyone. And I do believe that we should be material agnostic. There's obviously attributes of good and bad about different types of materials, but we need to get on and innovate in the round, not be partisan about it. And one thing that I would just leave you with as a sort of reflection on what I saw 10, 15 years ago, when there was another sort of era of digital innovation. So when BIM, Building Information Modelling, became a thing, there was a whole load of people really passionate, mostly technology people, really passionate around wanting BIM to land in the industry, to drive it as common data environment and using digital models. And they all ended up starting to talk to each other in a bubble. Just a whole load of technology people having an argument over code around open standards, IFC files versus whatever, all of that language. They were talking to themselves. They weren't talking to the industry. The mainstream industry was over there, continuing to do things analog. It's got BIM is a thing now, so actually it has taken time and we've got there. But it's a really interesting example because what I worry about is that the MMC industry, particularly off-site manufacturing, there is a risk of us replicating that, of all getting really het up about how we should do MMC and innovate, but we're just talking to ourselves in a bubble. Unless you've got the clients in the room, the developers and the banks and the investors who actually fund our industry, and government actually, and they're part of the discussion and they're part of the decision around how they're going to commission their buildings, then you're pushing water uphill. You need demand to draw the industry in different directions. So this needs to be a mainstream debate about how we're going to innovate and do MMC properly, responsibly, and in a sustainable long-term way. So look, I've probably rattled on a bit too much there, and I'm conscious we want to take some questions, but hopefully that's given you a flavour of my life over the last period of time, particularly the last 18 months, 2 years, things that I see from my experience here in Oz that you've got an opportunity to do things differently. Happy to take any questions.